And the Zionists take more territory than they were given in the UN plan. From the beginning, almost all of the Zionist leaders had very expansive goals concerning borders. They wanted to build a greater Israel.
Well, recently, John Mearsheimer went on Judge Napolitano's podcast to give a true history behind the creation of Israel. He gets into some of the things that laid the foundations for the modern Israeli state and why some of these circumstances impact and are still impacting political circumstances we see right now when it comes to the relationship between the United States and Israel. So let's get his take on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Can you explain to us, please, as only you can, the origins of the State of Israel?
Yeah, I'd be glad to do that. And let me start by making some comments, 4 sets of comments at about 60,000 feet, really general comments, and then drop down to 15,000 feet and make a handful of comments that are more specific, but fill in the general comments that I'll start with.
Please.
So, the first of my general comments is that when the Zionist enterprise got started around 1900, it's important to understand that there were very few Jews, certainly very few Zionists in Palestine. There was an adage at the time that this was a land with no people for a people, meaning the Jews, who had no land. And of course, that was simply not true. There were a huge number of Palestinians living on that land. That's the first point you want to keep in mind.
Also, regarding that, those people were Semitic. They were related to the ancient Hebrews, and many of the people came in that were the early Zionists had European lineages. So, even the modern context and, scope through which we view anti-Semitism is completely wrong, with many of the Palestinians being far more Semitic than those that rule Israel's government, including its current Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Second point is, there's no way you're going to create a Jewish state on that land that's filled with Palestinians without doing horrible things to the Palestinians, without committing great crimes. And common sense just tells you there's no way you could create a Jewish state in a piece of real estate that's filled with Palestinians, again, without doing great crimes. And that includes stealing their land. And it's very important to emphasize that the Zionists understood this from the get-go. David Ben-Gurion, Vladimir Jabotinsky, and so forth and so on. They all fully understood this.
Yeah, not only did they understand that, they wrote, and there's documented facts that they understood this, that there would be upheaval, violent upheaval, if there were to be a Jewish homeland built in where Israel is sitting right now, which was Palestine. That's absolutely correct. And, we don't have to beat around the bat around the beaten path to get to the bottom of that. You can take a look at the early writings of people like Herzl and Ben-Gurion and some of the early Zionists that laid these things out. There's no question about that.
Third point you want to keep in mind is that the Zionists from the get-go paid very careful attention to demography. They were very concerned with how many Palestinians were in the land of Israel versus how many Jews there were. And 80% Jewish, 85% Jewish, that was acceptable. The ideal, of course, was to be 100% Jewish, but you didn't want to have more than 20% Palestinian population. So demographics mattered. The other thing that they paid enormous attention to was what was called transfer. We now call this ethnic cleansing. They talked about ethnic cleansing all the time. Not much in public, but in private they did, because they fully understood that to create a Jewish state in a land filled with Palestinians, they were going to have to do transfer or ethnic cleansing.
Some of them still use that language today, by the way. I think that either Israel Katz or Imitar Ben-Gvir actually made reference to that term, transfer, when it comes to their plans for an occupied Gaza, where there will be concentration zones and relocation. It's impossible to escape the parallels that was the Holocaust during Nazi Germany. and in the concentration camps, which sometimes were different than the death camps. And the parallels are alarming, even for people that don't really study the Holocaust, to hear these people talk about. But they're on the record. Katz is on the record saying that where Rafah once stood, that will be a concentration zone where they will concentrate the Palestinian populace in occupied Gaza. And Netanyahu has said there will be an occupied Gaza now. They're just going to take it over.
Final general point that you want to keep in mind is that from the beginning, almost all of the Zionist leaders had very expansive goals concerning borders. They wanted to build a greater Israel that included lots of territory. This was not stated publicly by most of the leaders, and the leaders had different views on what that greater Israel should look like. But David Ben-Gurion, for example, wrote a book in Yiddish in 1918 where he laid out his vision. And it included what we call Green Line Israel, the Israel that was created after 1948, the occupied territories, that's the West Bank and Gaza, parts of Syria, parts of Lebanon, parts of Jordan, and the Sinai Peninsula. So you get a sense for how ambitious the Zionists were from the get-go. They wanted to create a greater Israel. And
I just want to clarify, too, modern Israelis, including high-ranking officials in Israel, also cling to this notion of a greater Israel. This is not a conspiracy. This is something that they've published articles supporting, including the finance minister, Smotrich, that's sitting there right now, and including Imitar Ben-Gvir, who, is currently the national security director, which really is the national genocide director right now, basically the way things are going. But these things are laid out. There's been several different flavors of what greater Israel will be. Netanyahu himself has held up a map that says like New Israel, and that shows, one of the variants, one of the flavors of what people propose, including Israel taking over all of Sinai, which now belongs to Egypt, parts of Jordan, parts of Lebanon, parts of Syria, mostly southern Jordan, southern Syria, and different combinations of land masses, but a lot of them share this dream, this aspiration. And guess who finances this? Guess who gets to? The U.S. And guess who never has a problem with it whenever they try to expand the West Bank settlements or occupy Gaza, as is happening now? They never complain about it. They never do. No administration in my lifetime, not Trump, not Biden, not Bush, not Clinton in any serious way.
That's one of the principal reasons that Israel has no borders, no official borders today. I believe it's the only country on the planet that does not have official borders, because they're bent on creating a greater Israel, whatever that might look like. So that's the sort of big picture. But let's drop down to 15,000 feet and talk about the specifics. It's important to understand that few Jews came out of Europe to Palestine before 1933. And of course, 1933 is when Hitler comes to power. And I think there are about 4 million Jews who leave Europe between 1880 and 1920. 1880 and 1920, about 4 million Jews leave Europe, and only 100,000 go to Palestine. Many, of course, come to the United States. So you have this situation where there are not that many Jews in the land of Palestine. And then, of course, you have World War II. And after World War II, lots of Jews leave Europe and go to Israel. But
it's also important to note that some of the views of the early Zionists were in lockstep with early Nazi theology, because the idea behind that, you might say that's insane, that's incredible, how could you say that? But the idea behind a lot of the Nazi philosophy was that the Jews should be removed from Europe. Hitler had talked about this as early as in Mein Kampf or earlier, where he wanted to expand the Lebensraum and get rid of the Jewish population in Europe, or at least in the German Empire. And part of this was just, according to the Zionists, well, that's just fine. That's exactly what we want. We want to retake, what was the ancient kingdoms of the Old Testament in Palestine, which wasn't controlled by the Jews, hadn't been controlled by the Jews in thousands of years. So they seemed oddly aligned with some of the Nazi ideologues at the time. And again, I'm not saying that every Zionist was a Nazi or anything like that. I don't like Zionism. I don't support it. But if you go back and look at some of their writings, a lot of them were just explicit about this, and Daryl Cooper explores this in his series about the modern Israel and Zionism in Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem. Excellent series, I really recommend.
Most Jews prefer to come west, to come to places like Canada and the United States. So you have a situation in 1948, when the state is about to be created, where 35% of the population is Jewish, and 7% of the land is owned by Jews. So you just want to think about it. This is 1948, when the state is created. 35% of the population is Jewish in Palestine, and the Jews own 7% of the land.
Let me just stop you here, Professor Mearsheimer. How was the state created? How do you take somebody else's land and suddenly you become a recognized country?
Okay, it's important to understand that up until World War I, the Ottoman Empire, or what we today call Turkey, controlled Palestine. And then as a result of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, Britain took over control of what was called Mandatory Palestine. So Britain was in control. After World War II, when there was huge resistance around the world to colonial empires, i.e. there was huge resistance to the British Empire. The British were up to their eyeballs in alligators trying to deal with resistance in places like India and in places like Palestine. The Israelis, then the Zionists, wanted independence from Britain. The British reached the point where they were just fed up. So on November 29th, 1947, the UN, right, with the British in the driver's seat, pushed hard to create two states in Palestine, a Jewish state and a Palestinian state.
Before he delves into this, I just want to, clarify too, and maybe add some context. In the years before this, going back to 1917, where there was the Balfour Declaration, there were several steps taken by the British government to signal that they wanted this to happen. They didn't really enforce it. That was kind of an infantile measure that was mostly toothless back then, when they said they were committed to a new Israel, to the creation of a new Israel. But he's right. I think after years of lobbying and clamoring from this niche, and Zionists were that, it was not the majority of prevailing opinion either in the United States or in Britain, finally, gave way to this push that he's talking about in 47.
It's November 29th, 1947. And of course, Israel is created in May of 1948, probably about 6 months later. So that's how Israel was created. It was created by the United Nations, and behind that was mainly the British, but also the United States went along with it. So
that's a very hard truth for some people, that modern Israel was actually the product of globalists, a globalist entity, the UN, which many current modern conservatives, many of which are Zionists too, rightly shun. They say, hey, we don't want globalists controlling our policies, controlling our health mandates, our economic theories, our economic programs, etc. And I think they're right when they say that. They don't want globalist bodies of anywhere close to what constitutes the UN to do that. They don't want the World Health Organization. They don't want the World Bank. A lot of conservatives say that, but they do cite, this UN resolution, which was Resolution 181, as a legitimate way in which modern Israel came to being. They say, hey, the UN resolution says that this was, going to happen. This, what was at first a partition plan between two states that, the Palestinians wouldn't accept. And, that's why a war transpired, because they were literally trying to centrally plan a country. If you think there's problems with central economic planning, which I do, by the way, where do you find out the problems that transpired when there was a centrally planned country?
That's how it was created. Now, what you want to understand is that the map that the UN drew was not advantageous to Israel at all. First of all, they ended up with a very small amount of territory inside Palestine. And furthermore, they ended up with a population distribution that was about 55% Jewish and 35% Palestinian. Okay. And this was not something that the Zionists liked at all for obvious reasons.
Well, I just want to clarify, they were essentially bestowed through this resolution about 43% of the territory, with the Arabs and Palestinians getting 56 or so percent of the territory. And remember, the Palestinians and Arabs originally maintained before this UN resolution, before this UN mandate, about 93% of the land. So I don't know if it was extremely small, but he's right. A lot of Zionists still had problems with that amount, with 43% under this partition plan.
So in 1948, before Israel gets its independence, a war breaks out between the Palestinians and the Zionists as the British are leaving. And the Zionists take more territory than they were given in the UN plan, and they expel a huge number, probably about 700,000, maybe 750,000 Palestinians. This is the infamous Nakba. This is
how did they expel them? They must have used violence. They didn't compensate them for their land, did they?
They did use violence. And the fact is that many of the Palestinians left without putting up much resistance.
Yeah, if you want to read more about this, read about Lehi, or the Stern Gang, the original terrorist organization in that region, in Palestine. In fact, many modern terrorist groups take and utilize and are influenced by the original terrorist group there, and that was the Stern Gang. And there were others too, other extreme Zionist terrorist groups that, you know, tactics were utilized and influenced other terror groups to use for violent purposes throughout the Middle East. And, you know, Jews weren't the only ones, obviously. You know, the Islamists used those tactics throughout history too. I'm not trying to pass blame on any particular group, but terrorism inspired many different groups, this mass violence and radical kind of reaction to these things. But he's right. They took more territory than the UN wanted to give them and expelled Palestinians, and the Palestinians had enough. That's why a war was started. I mean, if you were kicked out of your land or property or home, many of them kept the keys to the home that they were kicked out of. It would inspire indignation and vengeance, and that's certainly what happened, all because of this high-level globalist mandate that was pushed by Britain and the United States.
And it was reasonably easy for the Zionists, and then later the Israelis after May 1948, to drive the Palestinians out. And the end result is that you get a state in 1948, which we call Green Line Israel. This is the Israel created by the 1948 war, that's bigger than the Israel that was allotted to the Jews in the UN plan. And furthermore, after all, the ethnic cleansing is about 80% Jewish and 20% Palestinian. Okay, so that's the first big event. The second big event, which is, of course, of enormous importance, is the 1967 war, the famous Six-Day War. In the Six-Day War, the Israelis conquer the West Bank and Gaza. These are the occupied territories. I might add.
Yeah, before that, Egypt controlled Gaza, and I believe at that time Jordan controlled the West Bank. They took those in 67, moved into Gaza. This was an occupation that was abhorred. It was prohibited by law. Even the UN, which set about to create this partition plan that disproportionately helped the Zionists, they condemned it outright, and they stayed there until 2005. And even in 2005, they didn't exactly leave. They brought a lot of the occupiers to the West Bank as other occupiers, and, you know, they kept the blockade going. They kept the crossings to make it almost impossible for the people to pass through there. They subjugate the people in various ways, hold their water and electricity hostage under many circumstances, you know, maintain strict control of what gets in, even though it's often caused malnutrition, emaciation, diseases, etc.
Parenthetically, that they also capture the Golan Heights. In the process of capturing the West Bank and capturing Gaza, they drive 200,000 more Palestinians, mainly out of the West Bank and into Jordan. So this is the second big ethnic cleansing. The first one was the Nakba in 1948, where you drive out about 750,000 Palestinians. And then in 1967, you drive out another 200,000 Palestinians and 80,000 Syrians off the Golan Heights, as I said. Now, the problem that the Israelis face once they conquer all this territory is that the number of Palestinians and the number of Israeli Jews in Greater Israel. Greater Israel is the Israel of 1948 plus those two occupied territories. Right. In these three pieces of real estate, you have roughly 7.3 million Jews and 7.3 million Palestinians. And I told you how much attention the Israelis paid to demographics. And at worst, they would accept 80-20. They really wanted 100-0. But here you have basically 50-50. And the demographic trends tell you that over time, the Palestinians will outnumber the Israeli Jews. So this is a huge problem.
Yeah, that was a big problem for many of the most ardent Zionists, for sure. And he's right about the demographics. I mean, that was one of the reasons that, the diehard right-wingers in Israel, the Likudniks, the people in power right now as part of this coalition, warned about following the Oslo Accords and the Oslo strategy, which involved, creating a Palestinian state and making peace with Israel's Arab neighbors. That just seems reasonable to me, right? That would be the best benefit not only to the United States, who bankrolls all of Israel's wars and their genocide in Gaza right now, but also, all the money pumped into bombs and everything like that. They could be trading with their Arab neighbors rather than subjugating them and bombing them all the time. And they've bombed 4 of them since October 7th, and that's not even including Gaza. Outside of Gaza, they've attacked Yemen, Iran with the help of the U.S., Syria, and Lebanon, and, taken claim to part of the territory in Syria and Lebanon under the Greater Israel Project. But anyways, that was one of the pieces of propaganda that they used, this demographic shift that, hey, if we make peace with our Arab neighbors, they're destined to outnumber us and surround us and invade us. 67 and 73 will look like a cakewalk, so we just have to regime change all the neighbors we don't want. This was the clean break strategy. It's something that Wesley Clark acknowledged when he walked into the Pentagon 10 days after 9/11. He saw plans laid out for 7 regime change operations that were being planned to happen in the next 5 years that Israel was supporting too. And the only one that hasn't come to fruition since then, since 2001, is Iran. The one they keep clamoring about happening right now. And that's not going to stop, by the way. They've always talked about how they wanted regime change there. Netanyahu has openly said we want the Libya model to apply there. But he's right. It's a demographic shift, and we're still seeing and dealing with it now. In Gaza right now, if you look at the casualties and deaths, let's say it's, 150,000, and there's different numbers, between 100,000 and some people think 300 or 400,000 people have died there. There is significantly less Palestinians than there were 2 years ago or 22 months ago, and I think it's something like 7.3 million Israelis compared to something like 7 million Palestinians now. And you can see they do want to ethnically cleanse this people. They want to set up concentration zones for the few survivors to languish in and just take over that territory. That's exactly what they're going to do. Netanyahu has explicitly said the decision has been made. We're annexing Gaza, we're occupying Gaza, and they've already turned world opinion and a lot of U.S. opinion against them. But world opinion and U.S. opinion be damned, even though the U.S. is financing this garbage, this nonsense, giving them $20 billion last year when we're $37 trillion in debt. And we're just supposed to smile and nod and act like there's nothing wrong with this as a starvation crisis breaks out. After they've reduced the amount of aid centers from 400 to 4, when we have whistleblowers saying that the IDF is committing atrocities, when we see those atrocities have manifested in about 1,200 deaths, where people are used as lures in these aid stations where they come out to get aid and are just picked off there. That's what's happening, and I don't want to be complicit with it at all. It's my criminal government involved in this. I don't pull any punches. I blame them too. I blame the Trump administration, but he's not exactly unique. Biden was like this, Clinton was like this, Bush was like this, Obama was like this. So it's just the Israel lobby and its insane influence over the U.S. political system. But I do want to hear from what you guys said. Do you agree with John Mearsheimer's conceptions of the origins of Israel? Does that help put things into context more pertaining to what we're dealing with today? And what do you think this ends in? Is there going to be a modern Israeli state that behaves this way into, years and years into the future? Or is there going to be a tipping point somewhere that just can't make this continue? Let me know in the comments below. Like this video, subscribe to the channel. Also subscribe to Napolitano. This interview was awesome. Mearsheimer is a legend as far as I'm concerned. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can help support the channel, and I'll graciously appreciate that. And in return, I'll give you access to all my videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.